This program is sponsored in part by Dinizulu Cultural Arts Institute, inviting you to their Fall Master Dance Class Series with Dion Monsanto, December 4th at Innovisions Theater Arts Center, 11428 Merrick Boulevard, Queens, New York. For information, 347-454-9026, 347-454-9026. Thank you. Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. We are joined by a sister who has been really focusing on an issue which is really of concern, which is of colorism. She is Dr. Sarah L. Webb. She has a platform which focuses on talking about this issue within our community, as well as strategies to heal. Let's welcome Dr. Webb to Cultural Caravan. Welcome.
Hey, nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for bringing this important conversation to your audience.
Well, let's get right to it. Tell me what inspired you to really target in on colorism versus racism as a whole.
One of the biggest things was that so many people already focus on racism, right?
Mhm.
And so colorism is one of those things that far fewer people talk about, far fewer people understand the scope of it and the complexity of it. And so I saw a gap. I saw a
Hmm.
hole that needed to be filled in
Hmm.
terms of our collective struggle for liberation, our collective, fight to advance our cause. And I saw too that without addressing colorism, our efforts to address racism are impeded, are hindered. And really, we sabotage our efforts at racial equality if we aren't also simultaneously trying to heal and rectify and address colorism within and without our communities. So that was really the big thing for me. And then also seeing how it was something that was continuing to infect future generations. When I was teaching high school at a predominantly Black high school, I had Black students saying things about their skin tone, other people's skin tones. And so I realized that it's going to continue if somebody doesn't like step up and start doing this work more explicitly.
And it's so important, as we were just talking off camera about, is unfortunately this issue has haunted us from the beginning. Okay, this issue of color, and certainly, and it's more of an internal issue. Racism, we all can embrace. We all can say it's an evil that needs to be dealt with, and racism is the key. But the insidious part is how it internally impacts us when we start within ourselves discrimination amongst each other. And I think that's really one of the things that we want to look at from a historical perspective. And maybe you can give us some focus is why has colorism gone under the cover, have not been addressed, and what do you let's deal from a historical perspective there.
Yeah, so colorism was especially across the African diaspora has a lot to do with colonization and the spread of, white violence and definitely the international trafficking, human trafficking of African peoples in chattel slavery, and how that violence, that physical violence, also came with psychological violence and emotional violence. And so the full scope of that violence was to make us easier to subjugate, was to try and make it easier to exploit us and easier to take advantage of our labor, our resources, our wealth, and our brilliance as Black people. And so I think colonizers knew that if they could convince us of our lack of humanity or our dehumanization, if they wanted to be able to hold power for themselves, it required us participating in giving up our power. And so I think that psychological damage of making us think that we are inferior or making us think that Europeans are more quote unquote civilized, are more beautiful, are more intelligent, and not even just Europeans, right? Even I think about, again, my high school students. Um, talking about, intelligence and studying and learning math and science, and the assumption that, oh, well, other races of people are good at these things, right? But I, as a Black child, as a Black student, I'm not supposed to be excelling academically, or, giving my focus and attention on learning culture, history, language, and the sciences. And so I think that has been the intentional outcome. So we talk about like self-esteem issues, or like lack of self-love, as if it's something that we just need to get over, or we just need to figure it out on ourselves. But what I tell people is that that is a direct intention of oppression. One of the direct goals of oppression and colonization over time has been Black people having low self-esteem, Black people not seeing their own beauty, Black people not seeing their own worth, right? Like that was an intentional goal, intentional consequence of slavery and global colonization. And so that internalization has, one, made it seem normal, has made it seem natural in a lot of Black families, a lot of Black communities, Black neighborhoods, Black institutions. A lot of times when my students were saying things, they were saying them as casually as if they were telling me it might rain today, right? And so there's this, it's been seen as like, oh, well, that's just the way people think, or that's just the way it is, quote unquote. And so that's part of the reason why it has gone under address, is because we haven't seen it as the problem that it actually, seen it for the problem that it actually is. And then there's the reality that on a societal level, when we look at the census, for example, our culture, our government collects data, collects information on racial identity, and not necessarily on variations and shades of skin tone within a racial group. And so I think on a practical level, one of the reasons we haven't had the level of awareness about colorism as opposed to something like racism is because there's been more data collected on race, and not enough studies, not enough research, not enough surveys and focus groups on color specifically. And so there's just that lack of awareness. And then the last thing I'll say is that there are Black people who benefit from colorism. And that's something that's really hard for us to acknowledge. And those who benefit from colorism historically have wanted to retain that benefit. They've kind of sort of seen it as an advantage for them to be slightly above other Black people because of their physical appearance, or because of their mixed race ancestry, or because of their proximity to whiteness in any way. And so I think that has suppressed the conversation in our community as well.
So who benefits from colorism?
Oh, there are a couple of ways I can answer that.
Mhm.
Because one, I could say no one. In a philosophical sense, these oppressive systems harm everybody at the end of the day. But there are marginal benefits, and sometimes like significant systemic outcomes and differences in terms of level of education, like how you're perceived on a job interview, how you're perceived when you're stopped by the cops or not stopped by the cops. And so those who are lighter skinned, but also have the more Eurocentric look. So maybe they are light skinned, but they also have a loose curl pattern or a thinner nose, or they have like light green eyes or something like that. So historically, that's been the group of people that has benefited from colorism. So colorism, the definition is it's a social system that privileges people with lighter skin tones and marginalizes people with darker skin tones. And I always emphasize that in that it is a spectrum. So it's not either or, it's not Black or white. And so a lot of Black people are somewhere in the middle in terms of their skin tone. And so in some instances, they might be the darkest person in their family or in that space or on that job. And then they might go to another room, walk next door, and they're the lightest skinned person in that context or in that family dynamic or in that friendship circle. And so a lot of us find ourselves with various forms of benefit. Even thinking about something like intersectionality. So we say, oh, well, these two people are both dark skinned and they're not having the same experience. Well, what's their socioeconomic status, right? Maybe one is disabled. Are there gender differences? And so it is a complex system. But when you look at colorism as a social system, it is lighter skinned people at the top of the hierarchy and people with the darkest skin tones at the bottom of that pyramid, and the various spectrums of people in between that.
Now, it's interesting you say this, because when you think about the fact that our colonizers, our oppressive, it was in their benefit to have this divide and conquer. If you can create these different castes of humanity, where you treat one group of people identified as African, of African ancestry one way, particularly those who may look, as you know, there was a certain, due to the abuse of Black women, there was a certain group of children who came out of these unions who may have looked differently, and the slave master may have treated his children a little, even though they were still slaves, but they may have went to different schools. They may have worked in the big house. They may have been treated a little differently than the darker skinned slaves. So to create that schism sometimes things were deliberate, you say, deliberately done to create this. And I think the insidious part was when, as you said, we and amongst ourselves started to discriminate. So there were societies, maybe you could talk about that, that were
Mm.
formed where you had maybe a lighter skinned group, where if you you didn't pass what was known as the paper bag test, you
Hmm.
couldn't get in.
Right.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'll start with the institutionalized slavery, because you're right, and a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, we were all slaves, and so it shouldn't matter," right? A lot of people just really have a hard time with this conversation because they think, "Oh, well, all Black people are treated exactly the same way no matter what," and that's historically inaccurate. And so one of the things with the mixed race children of those women who have been abused by white men is that you were more likely, even during the period of slavery, you were more likely to get freedom if you were light skinned and or mixed race specifically, right? Like the free Black people during that time were disproportionately lighter skinned mixed race Black people. But also, as you mentioned briefly, that they were more likely to also be educated. And when you think about the generational consequences of that, where during a time when it was illegal for the masses of Black people to read, and there were no schools, no forms of education for the vast majority of Black people, that created significant chasms and inequities amongst those who had mixed race ancestry, to be able to go away to boarding schools in Europe or to learn a trade that they can then use to earn some source of income, etc. And so that their offspring would continue to benefit from the fact that, like, even during slavery, my ancestors were educated and were skilled workers. And so that direct benefit across time. But also those classes of people, right, who generationally, because of the higher level of education they were afforded, etc., were again hoarding that and saying, well, we, in order to advance our cause, we are going to buy into the hype that we are more deserving, or that we are, in order to protect our interests, we have to distance ourselves from dark-skinned Black folks who white society deems undeserving or unworthy. And it's this survival tactic, right? And so I don't want to say it was still born from the white supremacist structure, the white violent structure, but trying to survive in that, trying to gain advantage and capital and resources and opportunities for themselves within the white oppressive structure. A lot of those people of lighter skin tones who had that mixed race ancestry would create social clubs, opportunities for themselves. They would marry, they would have arranged marriages to keep their future bloodline as light and white as possible. And they would really support each other in a small circle of community and society to try and create further distance to other Black people. So we had things like the paper bag test, which was implemented in Black churches, Black social clubs. And again, the purpose of the social club was to advance your socioeconomic interests in the community. Black schools, Black institutions, in terms of whether it be primary schools, private schools, colleges, and universities. Also, you had things like blue vein societies. You had things like the comb test, where for the blue vein societies, it was this idea that your skin had to be light enough so that we could see the blue veins through your skin. And with the comb test, they would pass a fine-tooth comb through your hair to see if it would go through. And so all of these things that, again, because they believed the hype, so to speak, that whiteness was better and that Blackness was somehow supposedly inferior, they kind of internalized this sense of pride that, oh, well, we're not white, but at least we're not like those other black folks. And again, the conjoining of the racist beliefs with the classist beliefs, I think, has a lot to do with how colorism has played out historically. And I think it is different. So I know we're talking about the global diaspora, but it is different in, say, the United States versus a place like Nigeria, where you still have colorism. And on the African continent, you have colorism in Central and South America. You have colorism in the UK, colorism in Asia, colorism all over the globe. And Black people exist all over the globe. People of African descent exist all over the globe. And I find that it is different in countries where Europeans have been the dominant class, where they have been the ones in office, they've been the ones owning businesses, versus other countries where, even though there's colorism and racism and colonization, you still have Black people in office. You still have Black people who are the president. You still have Black people who own the businesses and who are the school teachers. So I think that's one of the nuances, but particularly in the United States, where you had this sort of growing group of people who were of mixed race heritage, that one believed, a lot of them genuinely believed they were better, but also saw that they could advance their own economic interests if they bought into this system relative to people who are darker.
So let's talk about, we know what's happened, and certainly as it relates to how our children perceive themselves. As you know, you talked about being a teacher and how children are very blunt, about things. They'll call each other names. I know, but growing up in the 60s, 70s, if you had a certain features, dark skin, you called certain things, or very African looking features, or big nose or big lips, people made fun of you, and stuff. And I think I was also sharing a fact that recently I went to a gathering of family members, and it was these young ladies. All of them are considered Generation Xers, young, maybe anywhere between 20 and 30. And I saw them as children. They all range in different gradations of color, complexion. But when they were younger, but somehow as they got older, I'm seeing them maybe few months ago, and three of them out of the four, they were all sisters but half sisters, they use skin lighteners. Mm-hmm. And I mean, they just, and these girls thought they were looking, but it looked very strange for me, mm-hmm. And my niece, who happened to be about my complexion, was the only one who kept her original complexion. The others decided to bleach, and that is another sad, I feel, a sad requiem to this whole thing of racism, where you have some of the members of the community feeling that the best way they can be successful is to bleach their skin. Tell us about that situation that has happened as a result of colorism.
I emphasize the need to look at the research and the systemic impact of colorism, because that's why people trivialize the conversation. That's why people think it's less important, is because they think it's just something Black people do to each other. And what you're saying with the prison sentencing, for example, like that disparity is coming from white judges. Mm-hmm. The differences in prison sentencing, that's white judges giving differential sentencing to Black people based on differences in their skin tone. And so I want to really underscore that for anyone listening, that yes, even white people will differentiate amongst us based on our skin tones. And so some of the research that you're talking to is that even white people, even people of other races, will look at a lighter skinned person and think, oh, they're more intelligent, oh, they're safer, they're less threatening, etc. And they will look at a darker skinned person and say, oh, they're more likely to be a criminal, or they're more suspicious, or they're more threatening, right? And I think about the workshops I've done where I've said this very uncomfortable statement, but I am here to kind of call us to a deeper conversation. When we think about 2020 and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and you look at the long list of Black men who have been unjustly murdered by the cops, they are disproportionately likely to be very dark-skinned men, Black men who are larger in stature, Black men who do have the full features, the broader noses and fuller lips. I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. where Alton Sterling was murdered by police officers. And it's not a coincidence that he was a very dark skinned Black man with very full features. He was large in stature. And so, even white people, because they're the ones who planted the seeds of these stereotypes, right? It was the white colonizers who said, oh, these Black people are quote unquote savages, or they are threatening, they're criminals, right? And so the research says that even you don't have to be Black to participate in the colorist belief that lighter skin is better or safer, etc., and that darker skin is less than or more criminal or less attractive. And so that's part of why it is such a problematic issue, is because it's not just what your Black schoolmates said about you in fifth grade, right? Like, you're still seeing the consequences of this on the job market, even when the employers are white. You're still seeing this in the justice system, in the legal system. You're still seeing it in media opportunities. And when people bleach their skin, a lot of times we say, oh, well, you just need to love yourself. And that's true, but they're also responding to what we're talking about in the research. If you consistently see, like, oh, the job opportunities, the media appearances, the fact that people are just more well receptive to lighter skinned people in the outside world as well, then it becomes, for many of them, a strategic way to improve their life chances, to improve their life circumstances. It's
Mhm.
not just about perceptions of beauty. It is the desire to escape discrimination. It's the
Mhm.
desire to escape the antagonism that you get a lot of times for being darker skinned. And when
Mhm.
I say antagonism, I mean interpersonally, like one to one, but also, again, at the larger society level, that sense of being invisible or being erased. And I think the symptom of low self-esteem, or like not liking the way you look and therefore bleaching your skin, we have to also consider like why that's happening. And so it's happening because they have had real experiences. They've seen with their own eyes the way that having lighter skin improves people's life chances and life outcomes as a pattern, right? And so I think a lot of times when people try to address colorism, they want to focus only on, well, let's just build individual self-esteem. But if you aren't addressing the social context
Mhm.
that wounds the self-esteem in the first place, it's like trying to stop a leak without wanting to fix the pipes.
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
we have to, it's really is, I agree, a sad consequence, the skin
Mhm.
bleaching. And so while we try to build the self-esteem and self-love of our children, we have to also be trying to improve the society that broke their self-esteem in the first place.
Exactly. And it's interesting because you talked also about how its impact on others outside of the United States. For example, in New York, we have a large Dominican population, Dominican
Mhm.
Republic. A lot of them are, my complexion, your complexion, are people, and they range from very, very light to dark. But I was sitting at a table, this was at a professional development a few years ago, with two very well statured, African looking, dark skinned, Black Dominican males. And they both, one of them was very convinced. He said, look, I deliberately married a very light skinned woman because he wanted his offspring to look a certain way. He didn't want them to be dark. And when I looked at him, I'm saying, and he reminded me of what's his name? There was a brother who's on what do you call, the Fresh Prince of Bel Air, and Tony, I forgot, Riviera or whatever. And so he showed me this picture, and all the children, of course, looked like the wife. It was very light, white looking woman, and he, the only dark skin there. But this is what he wanted. He deliberately set out to do that because he perceived that this would be a better situation. Case in point, there's a very popular export player, football, baseball player, Sammy Sosa. Now
Mhm.
you probably heard of him. He retired from baseball, but he decided, who knew that he had this issue with his color? This
Right.
man deliberately bleached his skin, obviously did something to his hair. If you saw a picture, they showed a picture of him in when he was playing, okay, versus today, he looks like a white man. He not
Mhm.
only bleached his skin, he changed his hair. And unfortunately, despite the millions of dollars that he had, this issue that he had with himself got him to the point where he totally made a change of everything. So that's, like you said, something that is a concern, in terms of self-hatred, the impact of this
Mhm.
thing. And as I said, it's not to blame anyone. And I think as we go into the next section of this conversation, we want to really look at the impact and what we can do about it, how we can be, and we just want to understand, to anyone in the audience, this is, hopefully people are looking at it as the beginning of healing. It's not, because, as I said, I know a lot of our brothers and sisters, light skinned brothers and sisters, who say they've been victimized by people who attack them for the way they look. They have no way that, and that's not good, for us to attack each other or to say something, because these are things, racism, colorism, were here before we got here. And I think at this point we want to say, okay, let's address it. Let's use it as an opportunity to move forward. So we hope that everyone will stay with us as we continue this conversation in terms of self-discovery and certainly healing. Okay. So thank you. And we look forward to joining our next segment. We invite you, people, to join us in our next segment. And I thank you, Dr. Webb, for staying with us with segment one. In segment two, we will continue the conversation. And I want to say to our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this broadcast. And we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. And please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.
This program is sponsored in part by Dinizulu Cultural Arts Institute, inviting you to their Fall Master Dance Class Series with Dion Monsanto, December 4th at Innovisions Theater Arts Center, 11428 Merrick Boulevard, Queens, New York. For information, 347-454-9026, 347-454-9026. Thank you.